This is the Mother of Boys Survival Guide podcast, your go-to resource for tackling the challenges of raising boys. I'm Cheryl Bond, and with me today is co-host and author Susie Shaw.
Hello, Mom.
Hey, Suze.
Hi,
Hello.
Cheryl.
Hey.
So last week, Dr. Paul Hochmeyer joined us to discuss Raising Remarkable Boys, recommendations for navigating neurodiversity, autism, ADHD, and more. And today we're going to continue that conversation with a podcast that we're calling Parenting Neurodivergent Boys, Strategies, Support, and Screen Time Insights, which all parents appreciate any sort of screen time recommendations. And we're going to continue the discussion where we learn tips for parenting the neurodivergent and the effects of media and technology.
Dr. Paul is a licensed marriage and family therapist and author of Fragile Power, Why Having Everything is Never Enough, and a companion book, Fragile Power 2.0, Wealth, Narcissism, and Mental Health. He is a clinical fellow at the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapists and a graduate of the Global Leaders in Healthcare at Harvard Medical School.
Welcome, Dr. Hochmeyer.
Hey, it's good to see you ladies again.
Hello.
Hey there.
Hello.
So, Dr. Paul, can you please give us a recap of what we talked about last week before we dive into this week's conversation?
Yeah, sure. We talked about neurodiversity, the concept of neurodiversity, which honestly is new. Came into the fore at probably, I think, 1998, which is around 25 years ago. And up to that time, conditions like ADHD, dyslexia, autism, dysgraphia were really viewed through the lens of a distinct, basically, illness. And what a researcher did in 1998, published some research that said, well, hold on here, wait a minute, that actually what these are the various diverse ways that the brain functions. So just like we know we live in a really diverse world where we have different genders, different colors, different races, that our brains are different and they process information and they process sensory information differently. And so instead of looking at these issues as ways in which our kids are broken, let's look at these things as ways that our kids express themselves differently. And by doing that, we've really, over the last 25 years, been able to change the whole trajectory of how they're treated and to help use these ways our kids are neurodiversities in our kids' brain to really help them thrive in the world.
Mm-hmm. And last week you touched on when you can start to see signs. If we can just recap that a little bit, when you can start to see signs in your child that indicate a neurodiversity.
Yeah, really, as soon as your kid starts to be able to interact in relationships and perceive sensory information. So some parents talked about they knew their kids were different because like lights were too bright for them. Like they had a really negative reaction to sounds. They were really startled, like in a way that felt different from the way that their other kids were doing it. And so again, it's based upon the brain. It's based upon specifically the central nervous system and how our kids process sensory information in a way that's different from the norm.
I will add that when my kids were little, I was trying to teach them that no, with the word no meant actually no, not something else,
Right.
which is parenting 101. And it's a really tough lesson to teach. And one of the things that I had to teach myself was to get down on their level, look at them in their eye,
Right.
let them tell me whatever it is that they were trying to communicate to me. I would
repeat
it back to them so that they knew I heard it. And then I could still say no. It's like, and the feeling that they had because they knew I had heard them made them a little bit less frustrated and more willing to accept no. And that training was so significant because by the time they get to be in middle school, you're going to be totally run over if you haven't figured out how to say no and who's in charge in the family. So do you have any advice for communicating more effectively with your child?
I think, it's if you have a kid, for instance, who's autistic, right? So you're going to have to figure out a way to communicate with the kid who, in a way that they can understand. And that's not going to happen overnight. That's going to come through trial and error, right? And there's
Hmm.
some understanding that your child doesn't have the capacity to really understand social cues in a way that's normal. And so what's a different intervention that how can you tell your child no, um, in a way that, again, I think you said it so articulately, that gives them the opportunity to express themselves, but in a contained, controlled, limited way. So, honestly, we all want a silver bullet, like we talked about last time. We all want a one size fits all thing, but just like our kids are neurodiverse, and we're talking about diversity, the interventions, the ways to address these are going to be different and diverse for each particular kid. There are certain ground rules, right? We talked about frame, boundaries, all of that. But then there's this gray space within those frames and those boundaries that you really kind of have to experiment and test to see what works for you.
I also felt that, not making assumptions about their behavior
Mm,
or why they're acting a certain way, or, if they are, if you don't realize that they're sensitive to something and that they have this overreaction, really trying to understand what's the underlying issue that's causing them to react so severely. So, and, really trying to get them to communicate, because I think as parents, you can make a lot of assumptions about their behavior based on your own experiences.
right.
So, I found that I started to get a little better at that with each child.
Right. Practice makes perfect. I don't know whether you got the
Yeah,
perfect.
yeah.
Uh,
So
they,
sorry about the first one always has it the hardest.
yeah, yeah. So, but I also think too, Susie and Charlie, you raised something that kind of made me aware. A lot of this is managing the parental anxiety around this,
Hmm.
right?
Right. Yep.
There's nothing.
Absolutely.
God, parenting is so stressful, and there's a saying that that I repeat frequently that parents are as only happy as their least happy child, and
Hmm.
that doesn't change, right? When your kids are screaming and, out of control, it causes a lot of stress, right? Parents feel so responsible and so when their kids are out of control, parents feel out of control. So by putting these boundaries and Susie, what you did in terms of saying no, but tell me why. Okay, no. Right. I mean, that didn't just contain your kid, it also contained you.
Yes.
Hmm.
So you
Yeah.
knew, right? There was a framework for you. That was like there was a boundary for you that you were then able to be there and present for your child. They tell us when we're in the airlines, and God forbid I've never had to do this, but in case of an emergency, put your air mask on first before you help anybody else. And I think parents in particular, God, it's so easy to get pulled into the vortex of chaos and just feeling so out of control, um, and being able to put our air mask metaphorically or maybe even literally if we're flying with our kids, is critically important.
I think that too, with what you're, just to kind of expand on that a little bit, is I do think that it is important as a parent to have self-reflection. Am I doing something to contribute to this situation escalating or being more stressful? Or,
Yeah.
I think that that's something that's, you tend to hyper focus on just the child's behavior.
Yep.
You do, and then you feel out of control, and then we're all terrified of being bad parents, right? Like we
Hmm.
don't want to be. That's like our greatest fear, is being a bad parent. And for those who are listening to this podcast, they're listening because they want to be the best parents that they can, not because they want to be a
Hmm.
bad parent, right?
Hmm.
Right,
They're
right.
listening because they're putting an enormous amount of pressure on themselves to be the absolute best parents that they can. And when kids are out of control, they feel out of control and they internalize the sense that, God, maybe I'm a bad, because, and then they get fatigued, right? Because it's exhausting. And then you just sort of, the spiral delves into, oh my God, I must be a bad parent, and then that's not a productive conversation. And it happens all the time. And it's important to be aware of when that happens and to be, that's really when we need to step back and say, whoa, hold on here. Let's just dial this, just pump the brakes on that crazy train a little bit and dial this back a little bit and refine grounding.
So when we were navigating school,
Mm.
which is a big part of that whole parenting
Oof.
journey,
Ugh.
um, I, I had to learn how to advocate for my child
Right.
in the school system, and we had serious talks about whether we should, keep them in the public school system or, move them into a school that was better suited for them, and we ended up um, staying in the public school system with the 504 plan, with support. And we customized the support that was needed, even with organizational skills. So I just called everybody a coach. So we would have we would
Right.
have somebody come to the house and help our executive functioning, you know, child that was having such a hard time, help him organize because it really wasn't my sweet
Right.
spot. I'm
No.
not really all that organized either. I couldn't teach him how to do it. So we just had a coach. We had this coach and that coach that would come in to help fill in. So do you have any suggestions for what to do in these, school settings, these, social settings and activities?
Yeah, I think sort of again slow and steady. And I think that advocacy is about joining with systems in a way where you can move together forward for a common goal. Sometimes we feel like we these things can get a little confrontational and conflict ridden. And so keeping the temperature down, and again, just being consistent and trying to keep your cool and talking about it in a way that doesn't pathologize anybody, right? Doesn't
Hmm.
pathologize the kid, doesn't pathologize their school, doesn't make anybody a bad guy here. Um, just continues to focus on what is the solution here, right? Because again, I mean, we talked about this last week here. We live in such a problem-saturated world. I'm so sick of problems, honestly. I'm like, okay, right? Like, where's the solution in all of this? And so, this and keeping the conversation on that is critically important.
Hmm. Yeah, and sometimes we even brought in a specialist or somebody that was helping, the coach. We would bring them into the school meeting to just help explain in a different way that could be heard better.
So this is like, I know Susie, Susie. By disclosure, Susie and I went to high school together. So we've known each other for a long time. She's very clever back then. She's very clever back now, and now. And so there's something in. I'm a family therapist, and there's something called triangulation. So when there's instability in a relationship between two people, you bring in a third party to stabilize that relationship. And it's the triangle, which is the most stable geometrical figure in the universe. And so by bringing in a coach, bringing in a third person into this relationship stabilizes the relationship and minimizes the conflict and enables people to work through the issues, minimizing the emotional reaction to it and coming up with a solution in an objective way.
So that person could be a therapist or a teacher or
Could be your brother.
a
Could,
brother.
Mhm.
Okay.
yeah, could be
Yeah,
a neighbor.
because how some, it is like we were talking about, it can be challenging if you do have multiple children and you have a child that um, is neurodivergent and maybe has some, more needs possibly. And I don't know if that's the appropriate way to say it, but maybe is can be more challenging with what their needs are because of that. How do you how do you balance that with your other children and yourself and your own needs?
You do it, you balance it. How do you balance it? I think sort of developing an awareness of it and recognizing that your other kids are paying attention and your other kids are saying, why does my brother, kids are super competitive with each other, right? Um,
Hmm.
and they're always looking to, is your hamburger bigger than my hamburger? Is your bowl of ice
Yeah.
cream, do you have more ice cream than I got in my bowl? Um, and so are mommy and daddy paying more attention to David because David's a problem, and right? And so the message they're internalizing is, gee whiz, if I'm more of a problem, then mommy and daddy will pay more attention to me, right? So
Right. Hmm.
that's the dynamic that we're looking at. How do so again, getting out of the problem into the solution, because that's what we do here. That's what Susie's book's about. That's what this podcast is about. Um, the solution is really kind of working with your kids and having conversations with your kids about it and talking to them and saying, I suspect you might feel this way. And like, can we please have a conversation around this? Or let's go play a game and, like, and do something and talk about it. And give your kids, I mean, I think Susie's intervention in terms of, I'm assuming it was an iPad, I don't know, about saying, taking the iPad away and saying, letting them go on, like giving them the opportunity to be heard and
Hmm.
having a conversation around it. So,
Hmm.
And do you have any resources for parents for and for their child, and where we could go?
yeah, I mean, I think there's some interesting. There's a great book called "Differently Wired" by Debbie Reber. Understanding Org is a great website that empowers parents. This is a great podcast. Susie's book is a fantastic book, particularly if you're dealing with boys. And Tilt Parenting is another great podcast, and one that addresses autism in particular is Moms Talk Autism.
Mm.
My kids. So I have 4 children, and my oldest was at a time when technology, they didn't have really iPhones. We didn't, she didn't have an iPhone probably until maybe high school. And then
Okay.
my youngest is at the generation where, kids were getting iPhones and using technology when they were 4 years old. But they
Yeah.
weren't getting iPhones, but they were using technology.
Uh-huh.
So, I mean, can you just talk to us in general just about the way technology is affecting our children, um, and their developing brain at a
Yeah,
very young age?
yeah, sure. It's affecting it in a very direct way. Let's not pretend. It used to be, the data was that this technology is not doesn't have an impact on our brain, but it does. So it heightens our it's very stimulating, right? And it's
Hmm.
constantly scrolling, and that gives us spurts of dopamine and oxytocin and all these what's called, fancy word is, endogenous opioids. So
Mm.
it means,
Woo!
yeah,
Yeah,
right. That was when I was a kid. But in any event,
I'm gonna throw that out to my kids. They'll be impressed.
and endogenous opioids are really good things, like we want our body to produce these things, right? We love oxytocin.
Hmm.
Oxytocin is what mothers get after their babies are born, and and enhances the connection that they have with the baby. It's what we get when we hug our partner, when we hug our kids, right? We get this wonderful warm feeling. Those are naturally produced. The technology is stimulating those, and what that does is our kids now have a higher baseline of satisfaction. So we talk about in the realm of addiction. Addiction is marked by like obsession, tolerance, and withdrawal, and continued use despite negative incomes, negative outcomes. Negative incomes is a function of negative outcomes, but that's a whole different. That's a whole different point. Um, and so we're looking really at tolerance, right? So the more our kids use these, the earlier they have access to them, their baseline level of dopamine satisfaction is higher.
Hmm.
Like when I was a kid, I would get my dopamine by running around the neighborhood and wrestling with the kids in the neighborhood and going home and being hugged by my mom and all of that. That now our kids are getting dopamine, hopefully from those things, but in addition, now they're getting this. technologically produced, uh, by technology produced means as well. And so their baseline is higher. And as a result of having a higher baseline, their tolerance tends to then be impacted. So they need more and more of the behavior to get the same baseline level of satisfaction. Um,
Mhm.
and then when it becomes a problem is, right, so these kids are, I have a patients where these kids come into my office and they're morbidly obese because they've basically been locked in their bedroom playing video games, smoking pot, and eating Doritos.
Hmm.
So,
Mhm.
it's looking at that and then figuring out how to intervene there, which is, limiting the amount of use, right? And then getting them some exercise and then getting them some fresh air and getting them out in the world. And it's a process. This is, just snap your fingers. It just happens over
Mhm.
time. So yeah, the technology
Yeah,
isn't brain under supervision.
finding effective replacements for the. For,
Effective replacements. Beautifully said. Yeah.
mhm.
When my boys were growing up, I came from a background in broadcast television, so media literacy technology is something I'm very drawn to and was very aware of, and probably from their perspective, I was aggressive about it.
Hmm.
So I did not let them have a television in their bedroom. I struggled to get the electronics out of their room when it was time to go to bed. Um, I used our Wi-Fi uh, provider to identify every uh, item device that was on our network and by person, and I would just turn it off. So it
Right.
would go off at 11 o'clock. If you didn't get your homework done, not my problem.
Right.
Mhm.
Um,
Love it.
and so, the keeping the tech, the struggle was real, and it went into college even. And so, what other recommendations and tactics do you have besides being the aggressive tech mom that I was? Do you have any other recommendations?
I like the aggressive tech mom, actually. I applaud the aggressive. I celebrate the aggressive tech mom, actually. I think
An
also,
ATM. We'll call you an ATM.
there you are. There you are. There's a whole other blog post now. But I also think too we have to be aware that like there isn't one. We just gets back to what we've talked about in both of these podcasts, where there isn't a one size fits all. Now, there are certain cases, so autistic children and other neurodiverse. It's the internet can be a great place for them to find community, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
have a community. I think the issue is so we're not gonna demonize, right? We're not gonna demonize technology and iPads and all of this, right? That's not gonna get us anywhere. And by the way, the genie's out of the bottle, right? This isn't going anywhere. And in fact, it's only going to become more and more central to our lives. I think the issue is in terms of this has always been an issue in parenting. Time eternal is healthy boundaries. This is like at the heart of all relational well-being and all individual well-being is having healthy boundaries with ourselves, with other people, with objects and substances in the world, and then with the world writ large. So I think now more than ever, having an awareness of boundaries and just as we're aware that how the quality of the food that we put into our body impacts our well-being, the quality of media and technology that we consume impacts our well-being as well. And so there's an enormous amount of disruption happening right now in the world, and the social order is changing. There's an enormous amount of chaos. It's happening super, super fast. People are feeling really ungrounded in the world. And so finding grounding in ourselves is critically important. And we do that through boundaries. So
Mhm.
boundaries, 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 boundaries. Yeah.
That's an important message.
And if you were going to have a mantra for this topic for moms, what would it be?
I think it's slow and steady wins the race, really. This isn't a
Mhm.
sprint, it's a marathon.
Mhm.
Yeah, a
Slow,
consistent consistent and steady effort.
Yep,
Yeah. I love
absolutely.
boundaries too.
Yeah, boundaries is
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I'm going to like wake up and go to sleep going boundaries. I like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, Dr. Paul, thank you so much for joining us here today and sharing your insights on neurodiversity. We truly appreciate your knowledge and your expertise and the impact of your work in the field of mental health, both locally and globally, is extraordinary. And your time here was just super special, and we really appreciate it. So thank you again.
Thank you too. It's great seeing you, and continue to do this work. It's really, really important. And to all those moms out there, keep on keeping on, slow and steady, slow and steady, slow and steady.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we hope you come back and talk to us about other topics in the future.
Happy to.
And to find out more information about Dr. Paul Hochmeyer's books, Fragile Power, Why Having Everything is Never Enough, and the newly released companion book, Fragile Power 2.0, Wealth, Narcissism, and Mental Health, as well as other podcasts and additional resources, please visit motherofboys.life. So thank you, Mob. See you soon.
And thank you all for joining us today. Follow the Mob on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and your favorite podcast platform. Be kind to yourselves, moms, and have a great week.